Good stuff.
In the parking lot of Hero League headquarters, Mr. Rence stood by his sleek blue van, pouring a bottle of Mountain Dew into the gas tank. It wasn't exactly conventional fuel, but it was what kept the van running at supersonic speeds, and today they were going to need every bit of that speed for their mission. The Mountain Dew fizzed slightly as it flowed into the tank, and Mr. Rence smirked to himself. He muttered, capping the bottle. He gave the van a pat on its side, knowing it would be ready to take off at a moment's notice. Just as he was about to check the tire pressure, a soft beep echoed through his communication device. Mr. Rence tapped it, hearing Connor's voice come through. "Rence, get back inside. We need to go over the final plan."
On my way.
He replied, tossing the empty Mountain Dew bottle into a nearby bin. He made his way back into Hero League headquarters, walking quickly through the corridors, and soon found himself at the entrance to Connor's office. As the door slid open, he saw Mr. Dugan and Mr. Callaway already inside, standing by the conference table. Connor looked up from a map spread across the table. "Rence, good timing. We're just about to go over the last details." Mr. Rence stepped inside and gave a quick nod to the others.
Van's all fueled up and ready to roll. Mountain Dew is the key to life, after all.
Mr. Dugan chuckled softly, leaning against the wall.
I'm still not sure how that works, but as long as it gets us there, I'm not complaining.
Connor gestured for Mr. Rence to join them at the table. "All right, listen up. Here's how this is going to work. You, Mr. Dugan, and Mr. Callaway will take Mr. Rence's van to Villain League headquarters, located just outside Harper, Kansas. You'll be the face of the negotiation, which will buy us time." Connor pulled out a small device and placed it on the table. It emitted a holographic image of the Villain League's headquarters, an ominous, fortress-like building with dark towers nestled in the flat landscape of Kansas. When you arrive, Plasma Man will be expecting you to ring the bell outside their HQ. That'll signal that you're there for the negotiation. Colton, Zach, Chris, and the amplifier will be hiding nearby. Mr. Callaway leaned over the hologram.
"So we go inside, pretend we're negotiating for the clone's release, and wait for Plasma Man to be distracted."
"Exactly. You'll head into the conference room to meet with Plasma Man. Once you're inside and he's focused on you, Colton, Zach, Chris, and the amplifier will make their move. They'll slip inside the headquarters and work their way to the cloning lab. The goal is to destroy the cloning machine before Plasma Man even realizes what's going on." Mr. Rence crossed his arms.
And what happens if Plasma Man figures out what we're doing before the clone machine is toast?
Connor's expression darkened. "Then we'll have a fight on our hands. That's why Colton, Zach, and Chris will have the amplifier with them. She'll enhance their powers, make them strong enough to deal with any defenses the Villain League throws at them. We need this mission to go off smoothly, but we'll be ready for a fight if it comes to that." Mr. Dugan cracked his knuckles.
I'll make sure the negotiation keeps Plasma Man busy. He's not going to suspect a thing while we're in there talking.
Mr. Callaway nodded in agreement.
"We'll handle the front end. Just make sure the team destroys that machine. That's the only way we stop the Villain League from making more clones."
Connor looked at each of them seriously. "Remember, this isn't just about getting the clone back. We're sending a message to the Villain League. This cloning machine is the end of the line for their plans. Once it's destroyed, they'll be scrambling." Mr. Rence raised an eyebrow.
So we're the distraction, and Colton, Zach, and Chris are the wrecking crew.
"Exactly. Get Plasma Man in that conference room and keep him there. Once the cloning machine is down, we'll have the upper hand in any future dealings with them." Mr. Rence leaned back in his chair, a grin spreading across his face.
Sounds like a good plan. The van can get us there in no time. I've got it tuned for supersonic speeds, and the Mountain Dew's fully topped off. When do we leave?
Connor glanced at his watch. "As soon as Colton, Zach, Chris, and the amplifier are ready, we'll meet outside in 10 minutes. Get the van prepped and ready to go. The Villain League won't know what hit them." With a final nod, Mr. Rence, Mr. Dugan, and Mr. Callaway stood up, ready to execute the next phase of their mission. As they exited Connor's office, the tension in the air was thick, but their determination was unwavering. They were about to face the Villain League head-on, and this time they had a plan to strike at the very heart of their operations. Mr. Rence headed back to the parking lot, already mentally mapping the fastest route to Harper, Kansas. As he climbed into the driver's seat of the van, the familiar smell of Mountain Dew filled the air, and he grinned to himself.
Time to show the Villain League what we're made of.
In just a few moments, the team would be en route to their mission, where the fate of the cloning machine and perhaps the balance of power between the Hero League and Villain League would be decided. In the dimly lit conference room of Villain League headquarters, Plasma Man stood at the head of the long, sleek black table, his presence commanding. Around him sat Plasma Boy, his son, who leaned back in his chair with his usual air of arrogance. The Snake, a sly and calculating villain who acted as Plasma Man's trusted advisor, and the Opposite Lord who sat quietly, her sharp eyes trained on Plasma Man, waiting for him to speak. The room was heavy with anticipation. Plasma Man had just informed them that the Hero League had taken the bait. They were sending representatives to negotiate for the release of the Chris clone, which had been captured by the Hero League. But of course, Plasma Man had no intention of making this a straightforward negotiation. This meeting was a trap. Plasma Man folded his arms and looked at each of them.
The Hero League has decided to send representatives for a meeting. They've captured the clone of Chris, but this plays perfectly into our plan. The meeting will be a distraction, and while we engage them in negotiations, we'll collect DNA samples from their team. The cloning machine will continue to serve its purpose.
Plasma Boy smirked, his arms resting lazily on the back of his chair.
So who are they sending? Shouldn't be too hard to outsmart them.
Plasma Man narrowed his eyes.
I expect Carl, my brother, will be overseeing this operation, but he won't be coming alone. He'll likely send his best, Mr. Rence, Mr. Dugan and Mr. Callaway. These three are formidable, but they're only part of the plan.
The Snake, sitting to Plasma Man's left, leaned forward, his fingers steepled. His voice was low and raspy.
You don't need to worry about those three. Mr. Rence's shape-shifting ability is tricky, but predictable. And Mr. Dugan's blades, though impressive, are nothing compared to what we can do. As for Callaway, well, we know his weaknesses better than anyone.
Plasma Man nodded in agreement.
Yes, but the real target is the team I suspect they'll send behind the scenes. Colton, Zack and Chris. They'll try to use the negotiation as a distraction to infiltrate our headquarters and destroy the cloning machine. That's where we need to be prepared.
The Opposite Lord, sitting across from the Snake, finally spoke up, her voice sharp and calculating.
So we'll deal with the decoys while keeping our eyes on the real threat. If Colton, Zack and Chris try to sneak in, we'll make sure they regret it.
Plasma Boy grinned, his eyes flashing with excitement.
Let them come. I've been waiting for a chance to face them again.
Plasma Man's gaze darkened.
We won't just face them. We'll use this opportunity to collect DNA samples from all of them. The clone of Chris was only the beginning. Imagine what we could do with clones of Colton's lightning abilities, Zack's telekinesis, and Mr. Rence's shape-shifting.
The Snake's forked tongue flicked out briefly as he nodded in approval.
An army of super-powered clones, each more powerful than the original. The Hero League won't stand a chance.
Plasma Man slammed his fist on the table, his voice filled with dark ambition.
This is our moment. Once we have their DNA, we'll perfect the cloning machine. And when that happens, the Hero League will fall. Every hero in their ranks will be replaced by a clone under our control. They won't be able to tell friend from foe.
The room fell silent for a moment as the weight of Plasma Man's plan settled over them. The Opposite Lord broke the silence.
So, what's the plan for the meeting itself? We can't afford any mistakes when we're trying to gather DNA.
Plasma Man gave a sharp nod.
I'll lead the negotiations, of course. But I want you, Opposite Lord, to be prepared to strike. If the opportunity arises, use your abilities to counter Colton and Zack's powers. If they try to fight, you'll stop them.
The Opposite Lord nodded, her face calm but deadly serious.
I'll neutralize them. Their powers won't work if I'm using their opposites.
Plasma Boy cracked his knuckles, his eyes gleaming with anticipation.
And while the negotiations are happening, we'll plant our traps. I'll make sure the lab is heavily guarded, but we'll leave enough room for them to think they can get in. When they take the bait, we'll be ready.
The Snake, always the strategist, added,
We'll need to time this perfectly. They'll be on high alert, but we can still lull them into a false sense of security. Once they think they've succeeded, that's when we strike.
Plasma Man stepped forward, his eyes burning with a fierce determination.
Exactly. The moment they think they've won, we'll hit them where it hurts. We'll get the DNA samples we need, and once we have those, the real fun begins.
The room was filled with an undercurrent of excitement. The trap was set, and soon the Hero League would walk right into it. Plasma Man looked around the table at his most trusted allies.
Prepare yourselves. The Hero League will arrive any day now. When they do, we'll be ready. This is our chance to bring them to their knees.
As the meeting adjourned, Plasma Boy, the Snake, and the Opposite Lord stood up, each of them filled with the thrill of the plan. Soon, the battle between the Hero League and Villain League would reach its climax, and the villains knew they had the upper hand. The Hero League was walking into a trap, and they had no idea. The villains began their preparations, setting traps and securing the cloning lab. The anticipation was palpable as they awaited the arrival of the Hero League.
You ready for this? As ready as I'll ever be. Just hope Plasma Man falls for the distraction long enough for us to find that cloning machine.
He's not an idiot. We're going to have to move fast once we're inside.
Don't worry. Once we find that lab, I'll boost your powers. It'll be more than enough to take down whatever defenses they have.
You guys focus on the lab. I'll make sure Plasma Man's nice and distracted with the negotiation.
After hours of driving, the van slowed as they reached the outskirts of Harper, Kansas. There, towering in the distance, was Villain League headquarters, a dark fortress-like building looming against the horizon. The 10-story structure was menacing, with towering spires and an air of danger that hung heavy in the air. Colton, Zach, Chris, and the amplifier hopped out quietly, crouching behind the cover of a few large trees and a low hill to stay out of sight. Mr. Rence, Mr. Dugan, and Mr. Callaway stayed in the van for a moment longer, mentally preparing themselves for the distraction part of the plan. Mr. Rence adjusted his jacket and gave a quick nod to Mr. Dugan and Mr. Callaway. Mr. Rence, all right, let's do this. The three of them exited the van and made their way up to the front entrance of Villain League headquarters. The ominous building seemed to loom larger as they approached, its massive steel doors towering above them. A single doorbell sat to the right of the entrance, small and unassuming in comparison to the size of the building. Mr. Rence reached out and pressed the button. A few moments later, the massive doors creaked open, revealing Plasma Man standing in the doorway, a deceptively welcoming smile on his face. His sharp features were calm, his demeanor unusually pleasant. Plasma Man. Well, if it isn't the esteemed representatives of the Hero League, I've been expecting you. Mr. Rence plastered on a friendly smile, though his instincts were screaming that something was off. Mr. Rence, we appreciate you taking the time to meet with us, Plasma Man. I know things have been tense. Plasma Man nodded, gesturing for them to follow him inside. Plasma Man, not at all. I'm always willing to discuss matters with my brother's people. After all, we're all reasonable individuals here, aren't we? Mr. Dugan narrowed his eyes slightly, but said nothing as they stepped into the massive lobby. The interior of the headquarters was cold and industrial, with sharp angles and dim lighting that cast eerie shadows on the walls. As the elevator doors closed behind them and Plasma Man led Mr. Rence, Mr. Dugan, and Mr. Callaway upstairs, Colton, Zach, Chris, and the amplifier crept out from their hiding place, slipping silently toward the entrance. Once inside, the vastness of the building hit them all at once. The interior was far more expansive than they had anticipated, with endless hallways stretching in every direction. The tension in the air was thick as they moved quickly, keeping to the shadows. Zach, okay, so where's the lab? Colton, scanning their surroundings, muttered, Colton, I thought you'd have some kind of telekinetic sense for that. Zach gave him a look. Zach, it doesn't work that way. Chris sighed, looking down one of the endless corridors. Chris, Rence has the map, doesn't he? And he's in the conference room right now. The amplifier, keeping her voice low, added, The amplifier? We'll have to search for it ourselves. It's a 10-story building, so we need to be smart about this. They moved cautiously down a long hallway, their footsteps barely audible on the sleek floors. As they passed door after door, they realized how labyrinthine the building truly was. There were no signs, no clear indication of where the laboratory might be. Every floor seemed identical, and the deeper they went, the more confusing it became. Colton, this place is a maze. We don't have time to search every floor. Zach nodded, looking more and more impatient. Zach, we need to find something, anything that leads us to the cloning machine. Chris, his voice tense, added, Chris, they're definitely going to have guards around the lab, which means we'll have to deal with security too. The amplifier looked around, her eyes sharp as she tried to sense anything unusual. The amplifier, let's keep moving. There's bound to be some sign of where they're keeping it. They wouldn't put something this important out in the open. They continued their search, moving quickly and quietly through the sterile hallways. But as they ventured deeper into the building, the nagging feeling that they were running out of time gnawed at all of them. If they couldn't find the lab soon, Plasma Man's trap would spring, and their entire plan would fall apart. Colton, we need to find that lab before Plasma Man realizes we're here. Let's split up and cover more ground. The amplifier nodded. The amplifier, we'll rendezvous if any of us find something. And with that, they continued their search, knowing that time was quickly slipping through their fingers. The fate of their mission, and perhaps the Hero League itself, depended on them finding the cloning machine before it was too late.
On the 5th floor, the atmosphere in the conference room was tense. Plasma Man sat at the head of the long, dark table, his expression cold and calculating as he faced Mr. Rence, Mr. Dugan, and Mr. Callaway. Beside him, Plasma Boy leaned back casually in his chair, a smug smile on his face, while the snake sat with his fingers steepled, eyes flicking between the Hero League representatives like a predator sizing up its prey. Mr. Rence, seated across from Plasma Man, maintained a calm and professional demeanor. He began the negotiation, laying out the Hero League's position.
Colton and Zach managed to capture the clone of Chris in the park. As you know, he was wreaking havoc, trying to spread destruction. We locked him up in the basement of Hero League headquarters.
Plasma Man's eyes flickered with interest, but he kept silent, letting Mr. Rence continue.
We know the clone is valuable to you. If you want to see him again, we're willing to negotiate. But there are terms.
And what terms would those be? We'll hand over the clone, on the condition that you stop operating the cloning machine. We know you've perfected it, and it's only a matter of time before you start using it to create more clones of other heroes.
Plasma Man's eyes darkened, but he said nothing at first. The snake glanced at him before speaking, his voice a low hiss.
You want us to give up the machine in exchange for one clone? That hardly seems like a fair deal.
It's more than just a clone. We know the power that machine holds, and if you continue using it, the consequences could be catastrophic for both sides.
Plasma Man finally spoke, his voice smooth but dangerous. You expect us to give up revolutionary technology? Technology that can change the world just because you've locked up one of our clones? You're asking us to abandon something that took years to develop. And in exchange you offer nothing. The clone is already in your custody, you're not giving up anything, and you expect us to hand over the machine?
This technology, if left unchecked, could lead to a full-scale war. You know that as well as we do.
Plasma Man's eyes narrowed, his anger barely contained. War is inevitable. What you're asking for is the surrender of a key weapon in that war, and you offer nothing in return but the clone, which, if you've captured it, clearly wasn't as valuable as you think. If we're to give up the machine, you'll need to offer more. We're not simply giving up our most important asset for free. Mr. Callaway, sensing the growing tension, spoke calmly.
This is an opportunity to avoid an escalation that benefits no one. We understand the machine is revolutionary, but we're offering you a way out of this conflict before it gets worse.
Plasma Man's lips curled into a slight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. Revolutionary doesn't begin to describe it. That machine can change the world in ways you can't even imagine, and yet you're asking us to simply hand it over. No. If you want us to give up the cloning machine, you're going to have to offer more, far more. The snake nodded, his voice slippery.
You have something we want. What else are you willing to put on the table?
Mr. Rence exchanged a glance with Mr. Dugan and Mr. Callaway. The tension in the room was thick, and it was clear that Plasma Man wasn't going to give in easily. They had known this negotiation would be tough, but it was quickly becoming a stalemate. It was now a question of what they could offer that would be worth the machine. Meanwhile, on the 8th floor, Colton and Zach wandered the sterile, dimly lit corridors, searching for any sign of the cloning lab. After what felt like an eternity of walking through identical hallways, Colton suddenly stopped, his eyes widening.
Zach, that's it.
Zach narrowed his eyes, focusing on the door. There were 2 armed guards standing outside, their expressions stoic and alert.
Looks like we found the lab, but it's not going to be easy getting in there.
Colton tapped his earpiece, connecting to Chris and the amplifier, who were still searching the 3rd floor.
Chris, amplifier, we found the lab. It's on the 8th floor. You need to get up here, but be careful. There are guards posted outside.
Chris's voice came through the earpiece, a mix of relief and tension. Got it, we're on our way. The amplifier added, once we're all together, I can boost your powers and we'll get through those guards. Just hold tight until we get there. Colton and Zack exchanged a look, keeping to the shadows as they waited for Chris and the amplifier to join them. The ticking clock in their minds was growing louder. Every second they spent waiting was another second closer to Plasma Man, realizing something was wrong.
We'll have to move fast once they get here. The longer we're up here, the more likely they'll realize we're not where we're supposed to be.
We're taking that machine down today, no matter what.
The amplifier standing next to Chris on the 3rd floor tapped his shoulder urgently. Chris, we need to head up to the 8th floor. Colton and Zack found the lab. They're waiting for us. Chris nodded, his jaw tightening. Let's go. We're running out of time. The two of them hurried to the nearest staircase, making their way up to the 8th floor with quick, quiet steps. The tension was palpable as they ascended, both knowing that the mission hung on their ability to get into the lab and destroy the cloning machine before Plasma Man realized what was happening. Once they reached the 8th floor, Colton and Zack were already waiting for them in the shadows near the heavily guarded door.
There you are. They won't let us through, so we're going to have to take them out.
We've been waiting for you two. Let's get this done quickly and quietly.
The amplifier positioned herself behind Colton, Zack and Chris, ready to boost their powers when the moment came. When I enhance you, don't hold back. We need to neutralize them fast. The group approached the guards, trying to act casual at first. Colton cleared his throat, stepping forward.
We need to get into the lab.
The guards immediately tensed, their hands moving to their weapons. This area is restricted. No one gets through here without clearance. Chris, already on edge, tried to keep his cool. We're with the Hero League. We don't need clearance. The guards didn't budge. Orders are orders. Leave now, or we'll have to make you leave. Colton narrowed his eyes, his fingers sparking with electricity.
Not happening.
Before the guards could react, Colton unleashed a burst of lightning, striking them both with precision. The guards convulsed as the electricity coursed through their bodies, dropping to the ground in seconds, unconscious.
Nice work.
All right. Let's get inside before Chris could finish his sentence, a loud rumble echoed through the hallway. The floor trembled beneath their feet, and suddenly stones and rocks started flying toward them from behind, pelting Chris in the back and knocking him to the ground.
Chris!
Colton turned to see who had attacked. Emerging from the shadows was the opposite lord, her face twisted into a wicked smile. Did you really think you could sneak in here without us knowing? Chris groaned, trying to get back to his feet, but more stones crashed into him, sending him sprawling. She's using the opposite of my powers. Rocks, stones, I can't fight back. The amplifier's eyes narrowed. Not if I have anything to say about it. She reached out and touched Chris's arm, sending a surge of energy through him. Instantly, Chris felt a rush of power, his connection to the natural world amplified tenfold. He could sense the nearby plants and vines struggling beneath the floor, waiting to be unleashed. With a renewed sense of strength, Chris pushed himself up and thrust his hand toward the ground. Thick vines burst through the cracks in the floor, shooting toward the opposite lord and wrapping around her legs. She tried to send more stones at Chris, but he quickly countered by raising a wall of grass in front of him. You're up! Colton's eyes flashed with energy as his powers surged, lightning crackling around him with even more intensity.
Oh, you're going to regret showing up, opposite lord.
Zack, now fully boosted by the amplifier, concentrated his telekinetic powers, causing the air around them to ripple with invisible force. The opposite lord struggled against the vines, but before she could break free, Colton unleashed another powerful bolt of lightning, this time striking the ground around her. The lightning surged through the floor, sending shockwaves toward her. She screamed, trying to summon more rocks to defend herself, but Zack raised his hand and sent them flying away with a telekinetic blast. Chris, now fully back on his feet, added his own attack. He directed the vines to tighten around the opposite lord, pulling her to the ground and pinning her in place. Not so tough now, are you? The opposite lord snarled, her eyes burning with anger as she tried to break free. This isn't over. Colton smirked, raising his hand again, ready to send another lightning strike her way.
Maybe not, but it's definitely not looking good for you.
Before she could respond, Colton sent another bolt of lightning straight at her, and with a final scream, the opposite lord was knocked unconscious, her body going limp in the grasp of the vines. The hallway fell silent. That was too close. Yeah, but we're not done yet. We still need to get inside that lab and destroy the machine. Colton stepped over the opposite lord's unconscious body, approaching the door again.
Let's finish this. We've wasted enough time.
Zack gave a nod, standing beside Colton as they prepared to enter the lab.
Once we take down that machine, the Villain League's plans are done for.
The amplifier stood behind them, ready to boost their powers once more if needed. The door to the cloning lab stood before them, one last obstacle before they could end the cloning threat for good. To be continued.